Right, so I think we have everybody in. So good morning, everybody. You're all really welcome to the final webinar in our Analytics in Action series. And this is our data visualization session. So we're going to talk about presenting with impact, so top tips for creating dazzling data visualizations. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Aoife Darcy. I'm the CEO of Chrysalis. And just a very quick intro to Chrysalis and what we do here. So essentially, the agenda for today, we'll have our presentation and then some Q&A. If there are any questions that you have throughout the presentation, feel free throughout the presentation to pop them into the chat. You can see there Michelle is on hand in our chat to chat away to everybody and to answer questions, or you can use the Q&A in the webinar function, or you can just raise your hand. So Michelle is there in the background. So Michelle can help out if you have any questions or technical issues as we're going along. And as I said, just to introduce Chrysalis. So essentially, we started in 2009 as the analytics store, and we work with companies to help them embed analytics processes into everything that they do. And earlier this year, we rebranded to Chrysalis. So that's where Chrysalis has come along, and we've done all kinds of things along the way. In terms of what our offering in terms of how we work with our customers, essentially we work across three main services. We create customized training programs, we do expert mentoring, and we provide consultancy services. And I suppose all of this is within mind of helping organizations to create teams and functionality within their business that allows them to use analytics and AI. So that's essentially us and what we do. So let's go. So we're here to talk about data visualization and what it does. And I've taught data visualization and used data visualization for a number of years now. And this is always kind of a definition that I really like in terms of what data visualization is. And it's from a company called Juice Analytics. That if you're looking for some really good examples of visualizations, they're a great resource to go and look at. But essentially, the function of a visualization is to communicate critical information to your audience in a way that they can understand, delivered where and when they need the information. I think this is a really, really good kind of definition because it captures everything that you need. So first of all, you're communicating, and it's critical information. And we'll talk a little bit around that, around how do you decide what's critical to your audience. So thinking always about the audience that you're presenting to in a way that they can understand, and obviously deliver them in a format that they can access. So what we're going to do, first of all, we're going to start with a little bit of inspiration. So over the years as I've been teaching data visualization to various teams, one of my favorite examples comes from Hans Rosling. So Hans Rosling unfortunately passed away a number of years, but in 2007 he gave a TED Talk, which is still renowned as the best statistical TED Talk ever given. And it kind of unleashed kind of people thinking about how visualization is used. So we're going to go for a little bit of hand magic to start with. So I'm just going to bring up the video. So this is where I hope all my technology works. And what we're doing here is I'm cutting into just a section within this TED Talk. I would actually watch the whole 20 minutes, but I'm not going to bring you through that as we only have 35 minutes for our talk. So hopefully you can all see that.
Every bubble here is a country. This country over here is China, and this is India. The size of the bubble is the population, and on this axis here, I put fertility rate. Because my students, what they said when they looked upon the world, and I asked them, what do you really think about the world? Huh? Well, I first discovered that the textbook was Tintin mainly. And they said the world is still we and them. And we is Western world, and them is third world. And what do you mean with Western world? I said, well, that's long life and small families. And third world short life in large families. So this is what I could display here. I put fertility rate here, number of children per woman, 1, 2, 3, 4, up to about 8 children per woman. We have very good data since 1962, 1960 about on the size of families in all countries. The error margin is narrow. Here I put life expectancy at birth from 30 years in some countries up to about 70 years. And 1962, there was really a group of countries here that were industrialized countries, and they had small families and long lives. And these were the developing countries. They had large families and they had relatively short lives. Now, what has happened since 1962? We want to see the change. Are the students right? It's still two types of countries? Or have these developing countries got smaller families and they live here? Or have they got longer lives and they are there? Let's see. We stop the world. And this is all UN statistics that have been available. Here we go. Can you see that? In China, they're moving against better health. They are improving there. All the green Latin American countries, they are moving towards smaller families. The yellow ones here are the Arabic countries and they get larger families. Longer lives, but not larger families. The Africans on the green down here, they remain here. This is India, Indonesia is moving on pretty fast. And in the 80s here, you have Bangladesh still among the African countries there, but now Bangladesh is a miracle that happens in the 80s. The imams start to promote family planning, and they move up into that corner. And in the 90s, we have the terrible HIV epidemic that takes down the life expectancy of the African countries, and all the rest of the world moves up into the where we have long lives and small families, and we have a completely new world.
So hopefully you enjoyed that. And just to start thinking about, so what I want us to think about is, it's a famous example, everybody loves it, is why is it good? What actually makes it good? So what I want to do is just run a quick poll. So what I want you to talk about is, why is this so good? So I'm going to launch a poll. And basically, I'm asking you, is it Hans's ability to tell a story? Is that what makes kind of the presentation so good? The motion in the chart, the use of color, or the chart type? So what are the things that make it kind of, I suppose, as famous as it is? So I'll give people another few minutes just to think about that one. About another 10 seconds to get your answer in. So that's fantastic. So we end our polling, and if we look at our results here, we can see about 42% of you think that it is Hans's ability to tell a story. Motion in the chart, some of you, nobody chose color, and one of you chose chart type. So I'm going to let you in on a secret. It's actually all of those things that is what makes this fantastic. And I think when we think about what it is we can learn in terms of how we can improve our chart type, so how can we embody what Hans does? How can we recreate it? Now, obviously, in this presentation, I'm not going to be able to teach you to present the way Hans presents. He's amazing. He's fantastic. He's an amazing storyteller. But what he does use is he uses visualizations really effectively in how he tells stories. And if we look at this visualization in particular, what are the things that he does, or how did he design this visualization to make it as effective as it is? So if we look at the characteristics of the charts, first of all, he uses position. So basically, when you think about the chart type, he uses position, which is basically a scatter plot, so where the actual points on the chart are positioned. So that's one characteristic. He uses color, he uses size, and he uses animation. So he uses direction of motion. So when we look at it, when we break it down by those pieces, they all are pretty basic. Okay, so you go, what makes them so effective? And to understand why they're effective, we have to understand a little bit around what we call visual perception. So visual perception is basically, there's a whole field of study. So I'm just going to look at one little area of visual perception for this talk. But essentially, visual perception is our ability for our brain to look at something visually and basically make sense of it. So when we think about visual perception, what's important about it? So I'm going to show you a kind of a bunch of letters, basically, in a second. And I want you to count how many B's are there in what I'm going to show you. So, are you all set? So, who was able to count the B's? Now, I do this all the time, and I can see a lot of you are currently laughing. So I generally do it in a room full of people, and people are like, Aoife, really? What are you on? At this point, you know, I haven't really lost the plot. I know we've been kind of locked down for quite a while now, but we're going to do the same thing again. So I'm going to ask you, how many of the letter B are present? Is that? So hopefully some of you will have been looking at it and gone, there were 4, wasn't there? And yes, if you said 4, you'd be right. But why was it? What is it now? Now, it's really obvious when we look at this. They're all red, okay? So we've used color. But what is it specifically about color that makes it easy for us to basically pick out the 4 B's when they're colored? And essentially, this is based on what we call visual attention. So visual attention refers to the various mechanisms that help us determine the region of an image that is selected for detailed analysis by our vision. So essentially, what visual attention does is it's the part of our brain that basically decides, as we're looking at an image, what are the little pieces of that image that we actually look at and get information from. And it's really interesting, the amount of an image that we look at any one point in time. If you put your arm out at arm's length and look at the size of your thumbnail, that's essentially the amount of visual space that we look at in our field of view that we ascertain information from at any one point in time. Now that seems a bit odd. So how do we gather all that information so quickly? Well, essentially our field of view is constantly flickering between lots of these little areas and processing the information. And essentially this is called fixation saccade cycle. Don't worry about the theory. Basically, it just means we flicker from different elements of an image and pick up information. So what essentially happens with the color is the color helps us fixate on those 4 areas very quickly. So in a split second, we can pick up information really, really quickly when they're highlighted by color. And essentially, color is what's known as pre-attentive property. So a pre-attentive property, so there's a limited set of visual features that are detected by low-lying, fast-acting visual processes within a period of a single fixation. So what we mean by single fixation is just as we just concentrate on one small bit of an image. So as we flicker between all these small bits of image, what helps us pick out information really quickly are these pre-attentive properties. And essentially they allow parts of a visualization to pop out. So what are they? Obviously color is one. And there's a very nice paper that I've referenced here from 2012 that goes through various properties. But if we look here, it's length, size, shape, direction of motion, color in both luminous and new actual color, position, and stereoscopic depth. So that's actually 3D. Okay. Now, what does this mean for our charts? Essentially, if we build charts based on these particular features or characteristics, then it'll be much easier for us to get information quickly, because essentially we can assess these properties in a split second. We saw it there with the letters. It was really, really easy for us to pick out the B's in a split second when they were colored. So if we base our charts on these pre-attentive properties, essentially they become easier for us to understand. And if we look at Hans Rosling's chart, he used position, pre-attentive property. He used color, pre-attentive property. He used shape, pre-attentive property. And direction of motion is actually a pre-attentive property. So all of the elements within his chart were based on characteristics that are really easy for us to get information from. So if there's anything I would say in kind of picking up on how basically Hans designed that chart, was he really thought carefully about the properties he used within the chart to convey the information as easily as possible. So tip number 1 is understand visual perception. Now, it's a huge area. And in all of 10 minutes, I've gone through one really small part of it. But definitely something, if you are getting into the kind of the area of presenting information, you want to do it really effectively, it's definitely worth reading up a little bit around. And there we looked at just that idea of pre-attentive properties and the use of pre-attentive properties to make your visualizations more effective. So that's one thing. So we're going to lots of people for inspiration today. So we're moving on now to Google. So I don't know if people have seen a Google dashboard before. Just in case you haven't, I'm going to just bring up our Google dashboard, Google Analytics dashboard here, just to show you what it looks like. This is what a Google Analytics dashboard looks like. For those of you who haven't seen it before, it's basically a dashboard that's used to present information on your web traffic. So how many people are using our site. So currently we can see the Chrysalis website has 1 active user. As we have like a really, really busy website. Anyway, so, but what I want to do is not worry too much about actually analyzing this in terms of our website. What I want us to do is think about, you know, Google are pretty good at this stuff. So how do they do it? What are the things that they do within their dashboards and how they present information? So the first thing to notice, if we look at all of the chart types, we can see that they are all built on pre-attentive properties. So we have position in our line chart, we have length in our bars, we have position in a chart, we have a heat map which has color. So first and foremost, from our last point, is we use, the visualizations use those pre-attentive properties, which is the first thing. The other thing to think about is that when we look at the dashboard, we need to think about who is it designed for. So when we think about that visual analytics dashboard, and we're just going to go back to it, I always think about the who, the what, and the why. So when we think about who is this dashboard designed for, and essentially it's designed for business users. So they're non-technical, so you want it relatively easy to navigate. You also want the information to be really relevant to that particular audience. And when you're creating a dashboard as well, you want it ordered in such a way that, again, we read information top to bottom, left to right. So the top left-hand side should contain the most information. And then as we go across and down, that the information generally becomes a little bit more detailed and kind of less important. So if we look at here, basically we have the Google Analytics home, and we can see here that we have nice line charts, really easy to understand for non-technical users. We have some key KPIs. So in terms of those key values that a marketeer might be really interested in off the bat. There's some nice interaction in these charts as well that you can use. But essentially, this has been designed with a specific audience in mind. So a non-technical audience, an audience that needs particular pieces of information about the audience that's coming to their website. So we have some overall statistics up here. We can click between different key KPIs. That is quite nice. And then as we go down, we get into more detail. Actually, clicked on the wrong thing. So as we go down here, we get into more detail. So about how we're acquiring users, where they're coming from. So it's a really nicely designed dashboard. And the one thing that I think is really good about it is that they really focus on the audience at hand. So who is the visualization or the dashboard designed for? What is the information that the particular visualization should contain, and why is it important? So when we think about the who, and this is again a great writer if you're looking for good references, this is Julie Steele. And essentially she says, when you're thinking about your audience, you want to think about how do people I'm presenting to absorb the information best. Okay, so really think about your audience and how are they going to understand the information you're trying to portray. And when I'm thinking about this, so when I'm working with teams, building dashboards and building visualizations, be it on just basic business information, or sometimes it can be on the back of an advanced analytics project where we're doing some sort of prediction work and we're presenting the information. Really important to think about the role of your business audience and start thinking about what are the decisions they want to make and what are the key questions that need to be answered. And this should always be your starting point. You never start at the data, you start at the question. Then you think about the work process. So currently, how are they working? How do they currently use data? How are they reviewing it? Are they data savvy? Can they, like using a dashboard, would they be happy kind of clicking through things? And then thinking about business process, any terms that you're using within your visualization, make sure that if they're business terms that they're understood. So it's really, really important that you know your audience is the first thing. The second thing when we think about those charts is what is the purpose of a particular visualization? And again, this comes back to the first point that I had in knowing your audience. In designing good visualization, you have to understand your audience. You have to really understand what is the specific questions that they want to answer. So what information should a dashboard contain? And one of the things that I always work with teams with, so rather than asking them, what chart types would they like or how would they like the information presented, I simply ask, what are the questions you need to answer? What are the decisions that you need to make? And one of the things that I really like, so if we think about the Hans Rosling example, I suppose he wanted to convey, he was kind of really thinking about conveying that trend over time. So he wanted to really highlight that the world has changed usually since 1960s, even though that people's understanding of that world hadn't. So he really wanted to kind of bring that point home, and he used the visualization really effectively to do that. One of the things, if you notice, the Google dashboard, and this is one thing that I really, really like about the Google dashboards, if we look at the actual charts in them, their title is by a question. So rather than telling me that, this is, user acquisition chart, the title is, how do you acquire your users? So it poses the question, and then the visualization answers that question for you. And this is something that I work with people quite a bit. When you're thinking about what should my visualization be about, you have to think about what is the question it's going to answer. And if you can kind of, keep that as your focus, you won't go too far wrong. So each visualization should be designed with a specific question or purpose in mind. And this is, really, really important to keep your focus. So then you think about, well, Eva, that's lovely. That's great. Thanks for that. But there's so many visualization types. How do I choose the right ones? And essentially, there's lots of literature out about this. And there's kind of some general rules of thumb, depending on the type of data that you have and what you should display. So if we think about all these different chart types, and we think about what are the types of kind of information that we should display in these chart types. So if we have categories, you use bars. You can also use pies and donuts. A lot of controversy about them. Not going to go into it right now, but they're basically your options if you have categorical data and you want to display them in some way. Depends over time. You're going to look at lines or bars. You want to highlight trends in the tabular structure. So let's say, for instance, that heat map that we see there, you can imagine that being a table of information. And if you want to see the trends in that table, then actually just using color, kind of a gradient in color to highlight the values is a really, really good way of doing this. And then obviously, if you've geography in your question, then you should use maps. And of course, a good old table. So in this, it's important. I always think, don't forget the meager table. And particularly where precision is important, where people actually want to know the actual values, then using a table can actually be really effective. So don't just think that visualizations have to be charts. They can actually be tables, and used effectively can be really useful. But I suppose if we go into this in a little bit more detail, and I'm going to use an example here. So this is a really simple example. you've been given the data that contains the sales for an online store for May, and we're told these are the numbers here. They're broken down by country and segment. And somebody says, we built an out chart for that. So if I take this data and put it into Excel, by default, it's going to create a bar chart for me. And I go, okay, that's pretty okay. So I have 2 categories and a numeric. So, but what type of bar chart am I going to create? So if I look at my various options, and this is just from Excel, I just put in this data. I can create 4 different bar charts really easily. Okay, within about 5 minutes, I can create these charts. So I've been asked to present information about sales. That's all I've been asked. So I would say in this example is that all of these are valid versions of charts on that data, but they all prioritize the information in a slightly different way. So you have to really think about what is it that you're actually prioritizing in terms of sales, right? So if we look at our side-by-side bars, okay, we can see here, and we can display them either horizontally or vertically. But either way, essentially the information that we can get here, what this prioritizes, we can see within France, within Ireland, within the UK, we can see the overall kind of trend per segment, okay? So we can see that in general, the yellow segment, so segment B is greater for all the different countries, followed by the maybe segment and pink segment and so on, okay? So this allows us to compare really well within a category, okay? But I lose some information. So the bit of information that I use, if I want to say, well, what's the total sales for the United Kingdom? Okay, so that's my greatest. So I have to somehow add up all these numbers in my head. Whereas my stacked bar gives me the total sales and also gives me the breakdown. So if total sales is my key piece of information that I want to know, and my secondary bit of information, how it's broken down, then this is a good chart type to choose. Whereas if I'm more interested in being able to choose the segments within or understand the sales between each segment and the total sales as secondary, then this is a good chart type. And then sure, we can go the whole hog. We can also do 100% stacked bar. And what this shows me is the proportion of sales that's attributed to each of my groups or each of my segments across my countries. So the information that I lose here is the total. So I can't see the amount. I can't see in this chart that the United Kingdom is much bigger. And so I can't see the actual values, but the proportions, I can see, which segment. Now, as it happens that, if you're looking at this, basically, there's an even proportion. So you sell equally to each of your segments across your 3 different geographic areas. So there's no difference here. So it might be interesting, I suppose, if there was a difference, you would basically just see different size in these charts. So what's really important when you're choosing your chart type, so here we got to the point where we're like, oh, we put in a bar, you still have lots of answers. And everything comes back to, in choosing your chart type, is what is the question of priority? What do you want your user to be able to understand first? So what's the most important bit of information? And you use the correct chart type for that. And then if there's secondary pieces of information that you want to use, then you use the kind of lesser important attributes in your chart for those. So choose the correct chart type for the job at hand. So really, really think about the chart type that you're choosing. So my next kind of hint, and this is probably, if you notice the Google dashboards, if you notice Hans's example, if you look at really smart visualizations, the thing that you'll notice is because they tend to be based on pre-attentive properties, they tend to be relatively simple. And what that means is that we can get information easily from them. So this is just an example. Is this easy to interpret? So this information here basically breaks down disease. So it's cause of untimely deaths and the reasons for those. So we have injuries, we have infections, we have various types of diseases. So you look at this, you go, is it easy to get information from this? And yes, aesthetically it's nice, it looks good, but functionally it's poor. Okay, so if it was in a glossy magazine, you know, that you just wanted good aesthetics, you might go, all right. But if we think about how we could present this information in a more effective way, this is a way of doing it. So this presents that information. So here, first of all, we have the chart title. So we're told it's global causes of loss of life. We can see the time it's from. So we can see by the titles on the chart, the various years. So we can see the chart to the very right-hand side is deaths per 1,000 in 2010. Then we can see the change between 2005 and 2010. And then we can see years of life lost per 1,000 in 2010, and broken down by the various diseases. So we can ascertain the information much more quickly from this visualization than we can from this. So I suppose my hint or my top tip here is, I think this is a great quote from John Fried, and be clear first and clever second. And if you should throw one of these out, throw out clever. Okay, so always think about prioritizing function over form. In your visualizations, get your function right, and then think about kind of making it look pretty. And particularly if you're designing things for a business audience where you want them to be able to make data or make decisions quickly from your visualizations, it's really, really important that the information is presented clearly first. So we then now come to one of my favorite examples. So in this example, does Apple have a higher market share than the category other? So Apple is in green and other is purple. So if you want to just put into the chat, so which do you think is higher? You can put in Apple if you think Apple is higher, and other if you think other is higher. So people just want to type into the chat which they think it is, just to get an idea of what people think. So some people are saying other, some people are saying Apple, some people are saying the same. So at the moment, from what's coming through, definitely people are saying Apple. Right? Now, shock. Actually, it's not Apple at all. In this example, the other, so that purple category represents 21.2% of the market share, whereas Apple only has 19%. So what have they done here? Essentially, they've kind of obfuscated the chart by introducing 3D. They basically kind of play around with our perception a little bit, because stereoscopic depth, which is 3D, is a pre-attentive property. So essentially, we can see it. It allows us to basically visualize things in 3D. So if we think that there's 3D in a chart, we immediately think there's depth. So we think things that are closer, or things that are bigger or closer, and things that are smaller further away. So it starts kind of, playing around like Father Ted and the cow, close up, far away, close up, far away. It's that kind of concept. But essentially, by creating 3D, we play around with that perception system, and it makes the apple, the green, look bigger, where in fact it's not. And if we were to do a good old 2D bar chart or pie chart, it actually would be a little bit clearer for us. So I'm going to talk now is kind of this concept of just like showing the data and only the data. And one of the ways of doing this is thinking about a concept derived by an amazing guy called Edward Tufte. So Edward Tufte wrote 4 amazing books in visualization. And one of the key concepts that he talks about is this idea of a data ink ratio. So this is essentially the amount of data in a chart. So data ink is the amount of information in a chart that represents actual information over the total information in the chart. And essentially, his concept is that that ratio should be as high as possible. So if you take the data ink, the ink representing actual information should should contain the line share of the chart or the ink on the chart. And just to show this in the concept, Here's a really, really obvious example. So here's a beautiful chart that I've created. I have to say, it pains me that software allows you to do this, but it does. It allowed me to create this horrendous chart. And this is just, it's a bar chart. We're looking at visualization of votes in local election. So what we're going to do is we're basically going to remove ink from the chart until we're just left with the information. So obviously those backgrounds can go, they're a bit shocking. We don't actually need the legend in this example because we have the labels, so we can get rid of the legend. We can use monochrome, so we can just use one color palette. We can probably get rid of the grid lines. I'd probably soften them rather than get rid of them, but we're pretty strict with ourselves. We can put in the numbers and we can remove the border. And essentially we're left with a chart that looks like this. And if we compare it to what we had previously, essentially we have a much cleaner visualization. And if you think back to the Google Analytics, all of their visualizations were really, really clear. And you'll often hear people referring to the idea of using white space. So rather than putting borders around something and having ink, actually just spacing things by white space can be sometimes more effective. So here, essentially, it's that idea that you should strip away any of the ink on your chart that doesn't represent data. And if you actually do this, you come up with a much clearer visualization. So my last tip of the day, I've run over by 2 minutes, so apologies, in terms of our plan is show all of the data and only the data. So that example with the 3D pie chart, there's extra ink in there, creating the 3D that actually isn't required. Now, you might be cynical and say that it was designed particularly well to tell a particular story in that instance. But it's really, really important that if you want people to get the actual information that's really important from a chart, just think about that idea of stripping back some of the I suppose, the need sometimes for us to like add stuff. To go, oh, we should add some more. Go, no, don't, strip it back. And really only display information that actually will enhance understanding, because sometimes too much information, people they get lost. So in terms of my top tips, really important. So one of the things that I'd say, if you're starting to look into visualization in a serious sort of way, I would look to understanding a little bit more about visual perception. I mean, we just touched the surface. There's so much in there, and it's a really fascinating subject. And actually, that paper that I referenced is really, really useful. And for that, always start with your audience and focus on your task at hand. So, who are they, and what do they need to know? And if you just list out the questions, so when we start, designing a dashboard, the first thing we do is we list out all the questions that the dashboard needs to answer. And then we work through question by question and present the information. And we might come up with 3 or 4 different ways of presenting the information and give that back to the audience and say, our stakeholders, and say, which of these do you prefer? Prioritize function over form. Always think about, what is my chart trying to do, and does it do it? And show all of the data and only the data. Really, really important not to allow your visualizations to be clouded in some way by just information that isn't relevant. So hopefully that was useful. So at this point, we're going to take some questions. This is always we have questions. So I'm going to check in with Michelle, who should be monitoring Q&A, and I'm actually just going to stop sharing. So, so one of the questions actually came in here through the chat, so you can use the chat or the Q&A. So what are the most common mistakes people make with their visualizations? I think the most common mistake is that people start with the data and not with the question. That they're like, oh, I have some data, I'm going to create something and present it, and hopefully somebody will find it useful. So that's probably the biggest mistake that I think people make. So how did you make the cause of death charts? That was actually an example that we borrowed online, but I can look up the tool and see what it was. So there's a good question here actually from David. So he says, what colors are best to communicate importance? So there's a couple, there's actually some, it's one of the tips that I could have added in, but I didn't, and that we talk about a lot when we teach is the use of color. And there's basically, there's 5 reasons for using color. If you want to highlight, so if it's some sort of alert, so you want like, you're over a certain threshold or something has gone wrong, you probably want to use red. But it's really, really important to realize that kind of a lot of people can be red-green colorblind. So you don't use green in conjunction with red. So you don't use red being good and green being, or red being bad and green being good. You tend just to use the red. One important thing to think about that. The other thing is if it's monochromatic scale, so if you have a numeric value and you want to think about importance in terms of light to dark, so kind of your shading categories, in that case, darker tends to be greater. So that's how you would use color in that case. So I hope that answers your question. So, so Connor asked a question, Connor, and yes, I will share some of the useful resources. I'll send it out in the mail. Anything that I referenced in there, I'll of course send it out. So that's no problem. Really good question, Bill. In terms of Hans Rosling's chart, in terms of a standalone visualization, I have used, in terms of putting direction of motion, which is probably the actual scatter plot or the bubble chart, will work fine in a visualization or in a dashboard or a static report. The use of direction of motion, probably in that animation, probably works best in a presentation. So where I've used it really well is where I've kind of displayed, done kind of live exploratory analysis. So sometimes if a company has a specific visualization tool and I'm doing exploratory analysis, I'll actually display. So rather than make a presentation, so copy and paste the presentation, the charts into a presentation, I actually use tools. So tools like Tableau or SAS VA or Click, and I present the information from the tool, and I've used direction of motion then, but it tends to be in a presentation, and it is really, really effective in that mode, but probably not as a static kind of standalone chart. But I hope that answers your question. So next question, how do you visualize data with many subcategories and perspectives? Each perspective may be important, but too many to chart. This is where using, so look up a concept called small multiples, and basically using multiple charts. If there's too many information for one chart, just break the questions down. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll have a series, if it's a dashboard, I'll have a series of charts that kind of tell the story and build up the story side by side. So if you want them to be compared together, you need to have them together, and you need to almost have the story going through the charts. So, if there's too much information for one chart, break it down into many. And there's probably some nice, if you look up the concept of small multiples, it'll probably give you some nice information into that. So next question, how do we assess the amount of text and explanation to include? I think it depends on your audience and what it is you're trying to convey. So if it's where I've seen kind of very detailed financial type reports and using visualization in those. So one example that I use for this quite a lot, you actually look up the Federal Reserve's annual reports. Now, they're like hundreds of pages long. They are incredibly boring if you're not into financial data. but they use visualizations really cleverly. And they tend to actually, as part of the visualization, they actually attach and annotate any text to the chart, but they are very technical type charts that almost need explanation. And in that case, actually annotating your chart with information makes sense. If you're, on the other hand, trying to create a dashboard that, somebody's trying to get information from quickly, if you have to annotate your chart with a whole load of text for somebody to understand it, you've probably gone down an incorrect design route. And I've fallen foul of this a number of times where I've, thought of a really clever way to present information. I've presented back to my stakeholder. I think one example in particular where she literally within 10 seconds of seeing the chart told me to take it down. I was like, no, it's amazing, please. It's really good. And I tried to explain it to her and she was like, no, I don't get it. And it was she had quite a specific business question that we were trying to answer, and she needed to be able to present it to a senior board. So she's like, they won't get it, take it away. And we went back to bars. So I would say if a chart requires too much explanation, think about the chart design. And it can be hard when you think you've designed the most beautiful chart in the world and somebody tells you that, nah, sorry, next. But yeah, that is one thing I would say. But in more technical type documents and reports, you can annotate kind of as much as you like. I hope I'll ask your question. And one question here, do you recommend not to use redundant encoding, or any cases where you would? So this is a really, really interesting question. So a redundant encoding is basically where you encode the same piece of information with two visual representations. So an encoding is a visual representation. So an example, you might have, sales broken down by gender, and you might represent gender by color and shape. Okay. So you're representing gender using two visual representations. The only time it's important, or where I would use it, is if you're worried about color blindness. So if one of your encodings is color, but you want to just make sure that anybody who's colorblind is going to be able to see the difference, then you can use a second encoding. Other than that, I generally don't. So that would be probably when I would use it. So another question here: what is your review regarding background on dashboards? Thanks, Balaj. Black background with contrast text or white. Probably a bit of a hot potato of a topic. I personally prefer white backgrounds. I just think they're cleaner. And I know this is kind of over the years, and I think tends to be people who program and are used to DOS windows and green text sometimes tend to like black backgrounds because they're kind of almost used to it. And some people kind of feel that the color kind of pops out better on the black background. I just think they can be very hard on your eyes. So if you're looking at a dashboard for a long period of time and the background is black, I think it can just be very difficult on your eyes. But there's a certain amount that it's a personal preference. If I had to choose, I would go for white. And I know, we had Stephen Pugh over a number of years ago to give his data visualization workshops, and he was like, black backgrounds are bad, never ever use them. But he was quite black and white about everything. So he was just like, you always go for white. I do think sometimes, and not to make aspiration, tends to be technical teams tend to prefer. Sometimes I'll see black backgrounds on kind of dashboards and kind of engineering environments and stuff like that. And if people can ascertain the information from it, I'm not against it, but my preference would be white. So I think that is all the questions for today. So There is one more. Oh, sorry, actually, apologies, Maureen. I missed your questions. Any suggestions for including targets versus actuals? There's a couple of nice things that you can do, and depending on the tools that you're using. So I really like, there's a very simple chart where you can just use a bar for the actuals, and a little kind of either a bar across it or some sort of shape to visualize the target, and just a very simple kind of bar chart with the targets on the bars is one way of doing it. The other thing that works really, really nicely are bullet charts, and I'll send you on an example of some of them. They work really, really well. The one thing you have to be careful about when you're using targets is, depending on your software, you have to aggregate your data up to the target. So you just have to make sure, sometimes if it's an automatic dashboard, you'll have to do a little bit of work to get your target data and your actuals basically aggregated to the right level. So I'll send you on a couple of examples kind of in the mail afterwards. And there's a few nice ways of tackling targets. Again, I'd be keeping it simple, but just caveat it with, where I have struggled, it's not so much getting the visualization type right, it's getting the data in the background aggregated right can sometimes be the trick there. So I think that now I've gotten through all the questions. I'm just going to check with Michelle, because she's been monitoring the questions as they've been coming in, so she might just check in at Aoife, you're good to go. So yeah, so I think I've gotten around all the questions. So first of all, thank you all so much for your questions. It always makes it so much easier when people have questions. And I suppose just one thing I've left really to say is thank you all so much for joining today. I hope that was useful. I could sit here and talk for about another 3 hours quite happily on data visualization. It's one of my favorite topics, and I think getting it right can really enhance your analysis, and getting it wrong, can really hamper people using your output and your analytics. So really, it's worth time. It's worth spending time in it and getting it right. Just in terms of information, if you are looking for anything or you want to contact me about any of this, obviously we do courses and training, and we also do quite a lot, and in the past we've done quite a lot of mentoring work where people have designed visualizations and then we've kind of gone in and critiqued them and helped them. So we'd be more than happy to talk to anybody about anything that we do in terms of this space. So you can contact me directly at aoife@chrysalis.ie, or go onto our web site, and there's a contact us information there. So without any further ado, thanks a million. Hopefully that was useful, and we'll be sending you out. I'll send you out some links and some information if required. So enjoy the rest of your day.